The conflict perspective, those of you that will remember, is all about power, right? Who has power and who hasn't power. And not what individual has power, but what are the social categories of power. For example, Donald Trump has power, but he doesn't have power because he's Donald Trump. He has power because he's in the office of the President of the United States, and he's the head of the executive branch. That's where his power is. Once he leaves office, perhaps in chains, perhaps, having a heart attack on the toilet while tweeting and going off to meet his maker, his power disappears, right? He doesn't have power. How much power does George W. Bush have? Like, he doesn't have any power, right? He did for 8 years, but he doesn't have any power now. So it's not about the individual, it's about the group. It's about the power of the group. So we could talk about the power of race, the power of gender, that there are groups that have power over other groups, right? So this is the power dynamic. And of course, the classic, and again, where this comes from is Karl Marx, the classic power dynamic that he was interested in is the haves and the have-nots when it comes to economic wealth. Basically, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the people who own the factories and the people who work in the factories. So we draw this power dynamic. I don't know what I could do. I should have brought my little chalkboard. This power dynamic to talk about who has power and who doesn't have power. So here, when we're talking about this, we're interested in who is doing the constructing. So symbolic interactionists are all about the construction of this deviance or this difference. Who is doing the constructing? Who gets to decide what the categories are? And what is being constructed? What categories are being constructed? Somebody has to do it, right? It's not coming from the spiritual world. We are determining what race is. Here are the categories of race. And so here what is being constructed is what's called a master status. So if we think of a ladder as sort of a bunch of statuses, right? Low, middle, high, any ladder that you're on. Here we're constructing a ladder and constructing a master status. Who's at the top of that ladder? And who has the power? So this means we have to spend a little bit of time of talking about what do we mean when we say power. If the conflict perspective is all about power dynamics and who has the power, what do we mean by power? This coffee's really good. Well, there's a couple ways of thinking about power. Number one is coercion. The power to get other people to do what you want them to do. The coercive power of a property owner to get people to pay the rent or they get kicked out. The coercive power of a factory owner to get people to work for whatever wage or they get fired. Like, that's a coercive power. It doesn't have to be at the barrel of a gun. That would be ultimate coercion, like, dig that ditch or I'll shoot you in the head kind of thing. It can also be economic coercion. If you want to live, right, so we can think of how this plays out in sexual exploitation. We can think about how this plays out in child labor. I mean, all of these types of sort of overt forms of coercion, but sometimes it's more subtle than that. But the thing that ties coercion together is the notion of exploitation. Somebody is taking advantage of another less powerful group of people. So coercion is one way of thinking about power. Who gets to coerce whom? There's all kinds of coercion, and that can happen on a micro level. There's a really sad report that came out today that during the coronavirus lockdown, domestic violence is going up. We're seeing more and more domestic violence as people are locked in the house, the abuser and the abusee, right? There's coercion in that micro level dynamic. But we also can look at that as a macro level dynamic about the coercion of men over women and the use of violence to force women into situations like you can't live here if you don't put up with the men who abuse you. Like, you are going to be homeless. And there are a lot of women who are homeless for this reason. So it can be micro or macro. The other way to think about power is autonomy. The ability to resist coercion, the ability to do what you want to do, what we might also call freedom. One's exploitation, one's freedom from exploitation. I mean, I think one of the reasons we love Westerns, I say we, there's a lot American males, I'm guilty of my own privilege. American males have a long history of loving Westerns. The idea of the old Western film is the autonomous male rides into town, Clint Eastwood rides into town, gets what he wants, robs a bank, rapes a woman, and that is in some Clint Eastwood movies, and then rides off into the sunset in the end of the movie. That's the ultimate autonomous male. But we have this idea, our country was founded on autonomy. We wanted freedom from the king, right? We wanted to rule ourselves. We wanted to be autonomous, self-defining, of course, owning slaves and not allowing women to vote and all that stuff that went along with it. But the idea of resisting the power to resist the oppression of others is also a form of. I always think, I was a bike commuter at Portland State, and I always felt like I was every day, twice a day, a great example of autonomy, because everybody that's stuck in a car is sort of stuck at the red light and stuck in traffic, and I was on my bike, and if I wanted to go up on the sidewalk or sort of roll through a red light, or had a lot more autonomy on my bicycle. So that can be a form of power as well. Another way of thinking about power here is access to resources. How much stuff do you get your hands on first? A historical way of thinking about this would be colonialism. Who got to go get the ore from the mines to make the metal? Who got to harvest the timber to make their trees? No, not their trees. Their houses and things like that. So colonialism was all about getting that stuff from other people, getting those raw materials. The modern version of this, I don't know if people still say this. Does anybody say dibs? I get dibs on that. I get dibs on that seat. I get dibs on, the DVD player. You remember those? The idea of getting stuff before other people do. So the idea that you have access to resources above somebody else is also a form of power. And so part of this notion of power in the conflict paradigm is the experience of the powerful, which we will call privilege. The privilege includes not seeing the power, not having to see the power dynamic, not having to experience the world that the powerless experience, and just being sort of immune to it. As a white person, not having to see racism. As a straight person, not having to see homophobia. It's somebody else's problem. It's now a wet cough. I think we're okay. I think I'm past the coronavirus scare. And so, the example that I use in my class when I talk about this with regards to gender, and I may use this example again, is when we talk about sexual violence, that women understand the daily risk that they take being out in the world because of sexual violence, and for men, you don't even think about it. And I'll come back to that example a little bit later. So there is also, privilege is part of power, denying the impact of the power dynamic. A lot of white people will say, "Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see, there aren't these things," or this is sort of the liberal sin of like, "Oh, no, I'm a man, but I'm not sexist." Like, yeah, come on, you're not seeing the impact of this, including your denial of it, as adding to the problem. So we call it colorblind racism or internalized racism, that we internalize these issues that we talked about last time. And also not understanding the impact. So first of all, is the people who have power not seeing their power and denying their privilege and denying the impact of their privilege, but also the impact on the oppressed, the impact on the people who are being exploited and are being marginalized. And that has a ripple effect. That it isn't just sort of one power dynamic, white and non-white, straight and gay. There are all kinds of intersections and ripple effects that make oppression a very complex thing. It's not just, "Oh, I'm oppressed." Like, think of the classic image of the slave master whipping the slave, right? It's much more complex than that. I mean, think about the many ways that poor people have been affected by COVID-19 in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of having their kids stuck at home with them and being expected to be homeschoolers, in terms of, the fact that when this does get better, their jobs might not be there. I mean, there are all kinds of ripple effects associated with being poor. There are what we would call interlocking forms of oppression. It's a very complex thing, that experience of being in the marginalized category. It isn't just being oppressed. It is all the multiple levels of that, including economic, including healthcare, including, having representation when you turn on the TV. I mean, we've been watching the National Lampoon Vacation movies. The last 3 nights we watched National Lampoon Vacation, National Lampoon European Vacation, and last night we watched Christmas Vacation. Those 80s movies do not hold up very well. And one of the things that you see in those movies is they're from a completely white perspective. There are all kinds of racial stereotypes. They're incredibly sexist. It's always about some shot of Chevy chasing somebody's boobs. And, I see, I'm told, oh, this is entertainment. This is entertainment. This is these funny, hilarious 80s movies that everybody loves. And my wife is like, God, like, am I supposed to be entertained by this, or is it just more shitting on people of color and women and all the multiple ways that that happens? So oppression is a complex thing, and we want to be able to kind of tease that out a little bit this quarter about the dynamic isn't just sort of this dichotomous, the powerful and the powerless. Even Karl Marx dealt with this. He had this term called the petite bourgeoisie. What about small business owners? Are they bourgeois or are they proletariat, right? It's possible to be kind of in a complex area in the middle. Okay, so to summarize conflict, let me see if I can finish this up real quick because I got a little on the mo. Diversity is a tool to maintain power dynamics between privileged groups and those they oppress. But diversity can also represent the resistance to that oppression. It's an important point that diversity also can be the people saying, hey, I'm here too. Brown pride, black pride, red pride. Hey, I want to be recognized and not completely assimilated into your power dynamic. So the power dynamic kind of manifests in two different ways when we talk about diversity. There's a way of maintaining this master status and the folks below it, or as a way of resisting that. Okay, functionalists. Let's see if we can blow through functionalists really quick. So our functionalists is our organic macro level paradigm to see society as an organism, and society evolves slowly. We evolve different things that we need in a society, like the way our technology has evolved to transform our society. Now we're running around in Ubers. Is that still legal, Ubers? And rapid change can be very disorienting. So some folks might know the term anomie, that sense of normlessness that comes from things changing too quickly. Okay, so here are we got some big questions here from this perspective. One is diversity functional? Is diversity functional? The biologists among us would tell us, yes, we need biodiversity. Yes, we need a heartbeat that's irregular. Yes, we need lots of different cultures to create the things that we have, because out of collision is creation, right? Think about how think about rock and roll. It's the product of the black blues and the white hillbilly music from Scotland and Ireland and England coming together in the form of people like Hank Williams and Elvis Presley. Honky tonk, the sort of classic country music. Tonks were blues bars in the Mississippi Delta area where black sharecroppers would go play the blues. Honky tonk is the white version of the blues, right? So you need that collision. You need that diversity to create new things. It's dialectical, for those who know your Hegel. We can be kind of sarcastic about it and say, well, is poverty functional? There was this great sociologist named Herbert Gans that wrote the Functionality of Poverty article, where he's sort of saying, yeah, we need poor people to pick up the garbage. If they didn't have poor people, nobody would pick up your garbage. And he was just being sort of tongue-in-cheek to say, isn't it nice for the people who aren't poor that there are people who are so poor that they'll come and pick up your garbage. Even Marx argued you have to have homeless people, you have to have unemployed people. He called it the reserve army of the poor, because there are always people who will work for less. So is that economic diversity functional? Yeah, but for who, right? It's certainly functional for the people who have money. So from our perspective, we're going to get into this thing we were talking about last lecture about pluralism and assimilation. Does pluralism add to our functionality? That's Ace Frehley right there. Does pluralism add to our functionality by having more different types of people? Does it make society work better, including people who might focus in the hotel industry and people who might focus in the dry cleaning industry? If we think about ethnic groups sort of populating certain professions, does that make it more functional? These are just questions. I'm not answering them. And therefore, is diversity something to be enjoyed? Oh, I really love all this diversity. And but is it to be something to enjoy to make our lives more richer, or is it something that's sort of sampled by the dominant groups to say like, oh, let's have a diversity fest. Let's bring all these people, out and enjoy all these great foods that we have. But really, we want them to assimilate. We don't want them to call themselves Mexican Americans. They're Americans, right? We want them to be more like us. So there is this, again, there's this tension from the functionalist perspective about is it functional to maintain pluralism, or is it functional to assimilate? So there's an example here that you might not have thought of, which is the issue of cochlear implants, which are the implants that are put for people who cannot hear. They can put a sort of little computer inside the ear that takes sound and it translates it to electrical impulses, and it doesn't allow deaf people to hear, but allows them to take these auditory sensations and translate them into something that sounds like sound, that they can hear as, oh, that's what that sound means, or that's the sound of a train, or that's the sound of the word pizza, or, they can kind of translate these sensories. And there is a huge pushback against, it seems like a brilliant thing, right? I mean, as a music lover, I can't imagine not being able to hear music or the sound of my child's voice. But there's a huge pushback on this from the deaf community, from people who are deaf, who say, hey, we adapt in our community. We have our own language, American Sign Language, and we're fine as we are, but you want us to be more like you. You want us to be able to hear like you. Leave us alone. Let our community exist as it is, and don't try to assimilate us in a kind of crappy version of your version of hearing, so it makes you feel more comfortable. So you don't have to learn our language, American Sign Language. That you are uncomfortable with our difference, and therefore, when these things cost over $100,000 to put these in people's ears to assimilate them. So here, diversity. The question is diversity a dysfunction of assimilation? That we want people all to be sort of the same, on the same page, as symbolic interactionists would say, but that doesn't work very well, because I have to learn all these languages, and I have to, deal with the fact that not everybody comes to my church, and so there's all this difference, and we're not assimilating them very well. And so is diversity a dysfunction of assimilation, or is it an organic response? So organic is always the functionalist perspective of valuing this notion of the collective, that we should all be on the same page, e pluribus unum, we should all kind of be the same thing, but also valuing individualism, right? We want people to be their unique true selves, right? Somewhere up here there's a record from Mr. Rogers in the kids music section that says, I am somebody, or I'm special. That's what it is. It has like a little mirror. I'm special. Everybody's a unique individual. That's what I got from watching Mr. Rogers. And so how can we fit into the collective? So this is sort of the organism trying to manage both these ideas, both these values of the individual being unique and the collective being a good thing. So here to summarize from the functionalist perspective, diversity is required for a functioning organism. We need different stuff, whether it's people doing different types of jobs, or just bringing more DNA to the table, bringing more kind of cultural and genetic diversity to the table. But it may also be a dysfunction of assimilation. Diversity may also be a breakdown of our ability to assimilate all these different parts. Okay, hope that makes sense. We've got the symbolic interactionists. Want to look at everything on a micro level as a construction of meaning and categories that we care very much about. Conflict people who look at the power, including the power dynamic that allows people to be privileged and oppress other people, but also allows those oppressed people to express their resistance to the power dynamic. And the functionalists who are looking at the functionality of diversity, but also the fact that it's sort of how the system may not be working very well, that we have to have all these categories of people. Okay, that's our starting point for our discussion on paradigms. Okay, well, next bit we're going to do is about kind of thinking about historical context behind the issue of diversity. What are some of the starting points for some of these power dynamics that we're talking about? All right, time to mow the lawn.